All right, let's get started. We've got people joining us from all around the world today. So I want to say, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today. In today's session, Burning the Candle, we're going to be bringing you the very latest thought, insight, and practical hints and tips to prevent workplace burnout. And we're actually joined by an audience from all around the world. So a couple of housekeeping things as we welcome new joiners. Because there's so many in the audience today, you're all going to be on mute for the presentation, but I do really encourage you to ask any questions that might occur to you as you go through the webinar today by typing them into the GoToMeeting panel. We'll be moderating them in the background for you, and we'll try and answer as many of your questions as we come to the end of the presentation. If there are lots, don't worry, please, we'll reach out to you afterwards to make sure that your question is answered. But in terms of structure today, I'm gonna kick off the webinar today with a few slides by way of introduction to the topic, and then we're going to remove the slides completely and let our lovely panelists speak directly to you so you can listen to their perspectives on the key issues at play today. But let's just kick off with some introductions. So firstly, my name's Faye Walsh. I'm the Director of Innovation for the Robert Walters Group. My team and I actually track trends and anticipate how those changes will affect our recruitment world. We principally actually look at new technologies, but also changing working practices. And we've recently been tracking how the global pandemic has accelerated the adoption of digital technologies around the world and already had a profound impact on the future of work as we know it. It's also obviously had a notable impact on the effective mental health of employees worldwide. And when we think about that burnout message, we know that messages to work harder or achieve more vary culturally around the world. But there's nowhere in the world that lives and breathes that sort of ethos of the hustle every day more than the major tech hubs of America. And while these places are breeding grounds for entrepreneurship and innovation, the links to depression and workplace burnout in these particular workplaces have been really well documented in the past. In fact, in the past, these incredibly successful companies were also celebrating their employees when they worked overtime, for example, or criticised them when they took time off, and perpetuated work-family conflict. But some of these companies have now come full circle and gone through incredible learning journeys. And so we wanted to reach out to some of our clients on the West Coast of America from the San Francisco Bay Area to bring you really unique perspectives from two venture capitalists and a tech startup to share their valuable insights on burnout today. We're also very lucky to have the other side of the coin represented here as well, a global company who's leading the way in changing workplace culture to prevent burnout in their employees. So why don't I hand over today to say welcome, Paula. Let's start with you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paula Judge. Greetings from the very early morning west coast of the United States, where the weather is beautiful. And when you sit inside and at your home, it feels like things should be fantastic. California is a lovely place to live, but as you all know, it's a bit of a disaster out there, and we've all been through quite a disaster. So I think that timing on this panel is great. I'm quite happy to be here. I'm a talent partner at Excel, which is a seed and early stage venture capital firm. And what a talent partner means is we help our companies figure out how to solve their problems through the application of good talent strategies, which sounds like a very fun job, but it's a challenging and complicated job, as Faye mentioned, in the world of hustle, in the world of innovation, in the world of you're only as good as your next great idea, and timing is everything, and we need to move, 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 move. In fact, I got an email at 10:20 last night. Somebody was available to talk. And I thought, you know, I'm gonna let that go and deal with it in the morning, because it isn't actually a crisis and there's no reason to talk, but that's the environment we live in. I've been in venture capital for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was a head of talent inside a high growth technology company here in the Bay Area. So I got to see what it's like on the inside as companies grow and scale. In Europe, I've learned you call it scale ups and scale outs. We just call them high growth. And so that was a fascinating experience where In 5 years, the company grew 5x headcount, and I was responsible for the team that recruited everybody globally. Prior to that, I was an executive search consultant. So I've had some experience looking at talent from the outside, from the inside, and now from the point of view of an investor, and certainly have some strong opinions on how we should think about talent strategically for success. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to chatting with you all.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let's head straight over to Janine from Sequoia. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And I am in a similar role at Sequoia and support our portfolio companies in their growth, hiring executives when they get to that point. Sequoia invests in seed, early and growth stage startups. So we're always looking for talent, and companies are more and more able to hire remotely. So it's been a really changing landscape in the last year, in particular in the last 4 months. In my prior life, I was a head of HR at a financial services company, as well as a head of recruiting in a high growth financial services company, and prior to that, executive search. So in my personal passion, I pursued executive coaching. And so part of that, I feel I can bring to my conversations today with people, founders, especially during a crisis and COVID and the racial strife that we're experiencing in America.
Wonderful to have your perspective with us today. So thank you for getting up early so that our European audience can bombard you with questions. Let's also say good morning to Dan.
Hi there. Yes, my name's Dan, co-founder of Sierra Range. We build software that keeps teams connected and productive no matter where they're working, especially when they're at home. I am an engineer by trade. I worked at Google during a high growth phase from around 3,000 to tens of thousands, and I've worked in early stage startups. So seen the candle burnt from both ends myself, working 8 to 8, and also lived a life in London as a contractor where, interestingly, I was more burnt out there than I was during the most high pressure times at Google. So
wow.
Happy to talk about this topic. And if my daughter pops in behind me, I apologize. She's asleep just over there.
No need for any apologies. Like I'm sure we're going to talk about now, it's all about being your authentic self while we're locked away. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from the West Coast. And let's also say hello to Sunaina, and thank you for joining us, Sunaina. Welcome.
Hi, Faye. Hi. Hi, everyone. So I'm representing the Middle East firm of PwC today. I'm actually in London, so I'm watching the clouds. I think Paula spoke about a sunny morning. That's not the afternoon we're experiencing here. But as I say, from PwC Middle East, I'm responsible for driving our diversity and inclusion agenda across the region. So the region comprises of 12 countries. We are approaching 6,500 people across these 12 countries, 5 generations in the workplace, and diversity from every single dimension that you can imagine. So it's a very exciting role that I have. 2 years ago, I was responsible for introducing and delivering our wellbeing strategy, Be Well, Work Well, to the region. And before that, I worked in the US, in New York, with our global human capital leadership team. And I was responsible for similar people experience related strategies as they impacted 250,000 people across 157 different countries. So hugely passionate about the work that I do, and I'm also a global mental health advocate. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak at today's webinar.
Gosh, it's such a privilege to have you all, and we're looking forward to learning a bit more about your Be Well strategies and some of the other programs that you've implemented as we go through. But why don't we kick off with a couple of introductory slides so we can just get everyone on the same page as we start discussing burnout. And just showing a couple of stats that are interesting up on the page here. Most notably, back in May 2019, obviously, burnout was finally acknowledged as a legitimate medical condition by the World Health Organization. And interestingly, last year, just before the global pandemic hit, we conducted a survey in the US, which found that at the time, 28% of the professionals that answered our survey stated that they were currently suffering from burnout. And we also found that more than 80% of people had suffered from burnout at some point in their careers. So it was already a troubling figure, I think, before COVID. But at that time, many companies were already starting to acknowledge and openly discuss burnout, mental health, and toxic workplace culture. But obviously, then we fast forward to the start of the global pandemic and that sudden pivot towards remote work, and it's had a massive impact on employee stress levels. We were just talking about a survey that was conducted very recently from over 100,000 global tech workers, for instance, and it's showing that the 4 indicators of burnout, and you can see some of the symptoms on the screen here, like exhaustion, fatigue, cynicism around work, and depersonalization, was shown to be at an all-time high at the moment. I think it's important to think about how COVID has, whilst it's been a terrible situation, it's increased our global understanding of burnout and raised the level of discourse that we've seen. And you know, we've seen clinical publications from China during the challenging circumstances, diagnosing frontline nurses with burnout and all the mental health challenges associated with that, but much wider discussion of the topics in all workplaces on themes like isolation fatigue, lack of connection, Zoom fatigue from overconnection, or the challenges of balancing a completely new way of working from home while balancing the challenges of life at home. And so it's obvious that mental stress during the pandemic is impacting our workplaces. So it's important to talk through the ways that employee well-being can be managed during this time. But it's also important to acknowledge how much our learning about this situation has accelerated during the recent months. And so we're trying to use the seminar, hopefully, to assimilate as much learning as we can about this critical topic. And while we're not going to be able to go into all the causal areas that are mentioned on the screen here, I'm sure we'll be talking to some of them, so that hopefully we can leave you with choices about whether this can be the time to break the taboo and change habits in your own workplaces. But what I'm going to do shortly is just remove the slides so you can see our panelists, and I'm going to open up the discussion first by going to Dan and talking about that understanding and recognizing stress and burnout in the workplace, and ask him to talk about how you define burnout and differentiate between healthy stress and the chronic stress that can lead to burnout in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, I'd like to say that maybe in modern workplaces, there's really no place for stress, that stress has biological purposes, but we shouldn't think of it as a necessary evil. What I'd really encourage people to think about is think about pressure versus stress. And pressure is being pushed to achieve more and stretch your abilities. It's pushing yourself close to the edge of your capabilities, but requires a healthy environment and support structure. Stress is obviously is a physiological response, and under chronic stress for long periods of time can have some pretty deep impacts on both your physical and mental well-being. So it can be very dangerous, and that's what leads to burnout. There's also a common misconception about burnout as being just working too hard or having too much work. It's less about the quantity of work and more about the quality of work. It's not just being tired, it's being exhaustion and feeling like you can't cope. So burnout is feeling both exhausted, but also having these elements of cynicism and despair. And what this comes about from is not feeling like you're in control of your own life, not having agency, or feeling alienated from what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So to reference my personal history, in the early days of Google, I would get up early in the morning to beat the California traffic during the mid-2000 boom. I'd work through till the evening, but I felt deeply connected with the work and felt like I was in a lot of control over my life. Compare that to a contracting situation in London where I was working a very traditional 9 to 5, but had deep apathy about the work, didn't feel like I had control over what I was working on or the quality of the work. And that led me to actually feeling way more burnt out than I was through the high pressure period. So for leaders, I encourage them to think about how can you give your teams control and agency in their own work? How can you connect their work to a purpose where they can actually feel empowered and engaged with their work? So that's like my sort of perspective. I also want to call out that it's not an individual problem. If someone's burnt out, it's not a problem with the individual, it's an environmental problem. So you have to look at the system that the individual is operating inside.
So you're saying that the onus is, as you know, not necessarily on the individual to deal with the challenge, but the organization in which they're operating.
Yeah, I like to think of organizations as teams, which is a network of people, so intercollection of relationships versus a hierarchy. So it's everyone's responsibility to look out for themselves and each other, regardless of reporting relationships. But yeah, it's a systemic issue and an organizational issue.
If I could jump in, I think you make a really good point, Dan, about burnout. It often is discussed from the perspective of, oh, this individual is burnt out. And if you read articles and you read the literature, it's all about how you can then take care of yourself to manage burnout, as if, you know, burnout is a thing that you didn't manage very well. Versus an environment that you're trying to cope in. I mean, I literally wrote down the notes from the first slide, Faye. 6 causes of burnout: unmanageable workload, lack of control, faulty rewards, lack of community, biased or unfair culture, and misalignment of values, which 100% describes the situation that we're operating in today. So I think that there is a situation that situations and environments cause it. And yes, there are ways you can better manage yourself, but it's hard as an individual to solve it or make it go away or cure it without some kind of larger systemic recognition, change, right? One of the other questions you asked, and I want to address that briefly, was how do you recognize healthy stress versus non-healthy stress? And I remember when we were practicing for this, we talked about as a manager or as a leader of teams, how do you recognize, do you acknowledge that stress or burnout might exist in your teams? And how do you acknowledge it at the best of times? So do you even have a framework for understanding, hey, there's maybe some lack of performance over here. Is that a performance issue? Is it a capabilities issue? Or is there some larger systemic challenge that we're having right now? For example, people feel very disconnected, or the workload is too big. But oftentimes, I agree, oftentimes it's not simply just about workload, because workloads vary. It's about the environment that you're trying to be successful within.
Right. So just one thing to add as well to Dan and Paula's comments. We did this seminar in the US in February, and we were not facing what we are all facing today. So at least 3 of the items on the causes of burnout list are not in our control. And I would point out that we have experienced several rifts and layoffs in the US, and I'm sure it's the same as well in other parts of the world. And that has an impact on remaining employees in terms of how they're coping and the stress related to taking on different workloads that maybe they didn't have prior to the RIF. And some of the other elements of the causes of burnout are in place because there are circumstances outside of people's control. So there are a lot about the circumstances that, to me, if I looked at this slide in February, I probably could not imagine a world where it was so starkly clear that there are things outside of people's control that can contribute to burnout in significant ways.
Yeah, a lot of the companies we're talking to, they're seeing burnout from people's personal life instead of the work life, actually. So to Janine's point, it's the societal stress, and then people are now feeling like they have lack of support in relationships and suffering from deep boredom and kind of sameness. So part of burnout is a lack of personal progression, and it just feels like the months are rolling by with no change. So people are getting burnt out on personal life as well as work life.
I think that's important. Let's maybe just take a moment to talk about the situation we're in terms of, across our audience, we're in various stages of lockdown. So obviously in London and in Europe, we've already started getting back to work. You're not quite back at work in America yet. We've got different situations and different circumstances going on, but we have all been locked down if we're not still. And Janine, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you had this beautiful way of framing how we're currently in a quite extraordinary situation. It's been called the world's largest remote working experiment. In fact, we did a survey in April and May and found that 70% of our clients globally, and we asked 5,000 organizations, they had transitioned to have all of their workforces working from home. And half of them had actually achieved it within the space of 1 to 2 days, which is an incredible achievement when you think of the size of some of the organizations in our client network. So they had 70% of companies had all their staff working at home. But you made the point that this isn't actually like planned distributed workforce or remote working. This is something quite different, isn't it?
Yes, it's a significant difference to suddenly tell everyone, don't come to work, log in, work from home. And in some ways, it was not planned. We don't have setups at home, to make it something that we can do on a sustainable basis. But it turned into a sustained work environment. So the real stark difference is that we went from, being at the office culture to suddenly we're stuck at home trying to work rather than being a remote workforce. Remote workforces and distributed work forces tend to be very intentional, and it was always planned to be that way on a sustainable basis. I think we've gotten a lot better because we've had a lot of time and we've fixed some of those things, but many things aren't fixed. The relationship aspect of being at home and the support system, in some ways, we're side by side with people and living our lives with our partners and our families. And in some ways that creates the sameness, the same day. So what are you going to talk to your partner about in terms of your day? Well, you lived the same day. So there's less of a connection and a communication. Those things that help refresh and restore us to attack our professional life suddenly aren't as nourishing as they once were.
And under normal circumstances, when we're thinking about the kind of the journey to enable flexible working for larger organizations, it comes down to trust, right? Because the idea of trusting your employees and granting them that flexibility to work in different ways is obviously beneficial for self-care. It's shown to lower stress and promote a better, healthier working culture. But Sunena, you talked about your journey at PwC and actually establishing the trust between leadership and workers on how to appropriately, get through that journey. And you were talking about some of the, some of the judgment from colleagues that you'd seen around the business. How did you deal with that?
So our journey prior to the pandemic and massively working remotely was very different from, I think, many of the European and also in the US, the experiences that workforces were having. So flexible working wasn't very mature. There were some people practicing flexible working, but certainly not all. Those that were felt that perhaps leaving the office a couple of hours early or coming in a bit later, they were experiencing the sort of judgment culture coming from their teammates. There was also an imbalance around single people sort of overcompensating for colleagues who were married or married with children. So there was a lot of different dynamics, and again, speaking to the diversity that we have in the Middle East firm, there was many different attitudes and approaches towards flexible working. The one positive thing to come out of this experience is that the COVID-19 sort of working environment has definitely accelerated change in mindset. So overnight, we've had to adapt, we've had to trust our people have had to trust each other. And I think certainly, especially, we try and request that we all have cameras on during our meetings. So seldom are cameras off for very important well-being reasons, as much as staying connected. But you can obviously see one another. But when you're looking into each other's world, you start to build empathy. So Dan started by saying, oh, you know, my daughter might walk in any minute now. Brilliant. I'm actually looking forward to that. I have no problem with that. I don't have children, but I think it's the human element that this whole experience has brought. I mean, humanity's response to everything we've been through is phenomenal, and there's some very wonderful things to come out of it. But certainly trust has been accelerated, the change in mindsets, and I think people have become a lot more tolerant of one another's challenges, both personally and socially. So I think that's a great thing to come from this.
Mm. And I'm wondering how, if we move on to sort of thinking about from a leadership perspective, how executives can actually lead by example, you know, learning from the circumstances that we've seen. You know, there's a whole ethos and culture that can be created by management when they approach these new startling circumstances in an empathetic and human way, as you said. I'd maybe just stay with you and ask about how you've been impressed by PwC's leadership in the way that they've led by example during this crisis.
Yeah, so definitely an enabler of well-being and to support our people through this time. It's really important to create that environment of psychological safety. This has always been a priority for us because in such a diverse workforce, you need to be creating an environment where people can bring their authentic selves to work and to everything that they're doing. Even more so, that's been heightened by the pandemic. And I think our leaders have been phenomenal. They've been leading with care, empathy, with curiosity, which I think is hugely important, to learn and understand what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, what your people are going through. But it's twofold. And I also think that leaders have a responsibility to be open and transparent. Our leaders haven't had it easy at all. I mean, if I stop and think of what their lives were like before, and the fact that they've had to continue managing the day job, continue sort of making decisions that impact our 6,500 strong workforce, plus plan for the future and plan in the unknown, and then very likely adjust to their own personal challenges at home. So these have been people who've likely been traveling solid for the last 10 years, 15 years. Now all of a sudden you're at home. You're getting to know your family again. Your children may have flown back if they've been studying overseas. So much has changed. And I think the one big message is that nobody has had it easy through this time, not one person. You can't say that because you're single, you've had it easy, because to Dan's point earlier, you know, the societal stress, the boredom, the loneliness, the isolation. But then does that mean someone in a household of 6 people has had it easy? No, not at all, because you have different responsibilities. So I think managers definitely can do a lot to encourage that psychological safety, not just caring about their people, but also showing the vulnerability that I've been through this too, I'm going through this. It just makes them very human, relatable, and it comes back to building that trust.
Mm-hmm. Paula, I know that we were talking about you know, how leaders lead by example, and you had an interesting story of the opposite angle. You know, how leaders can actually inadvertently create the wrong example when they follow what might be their personal goals but don't explain them appropriately.
So you'll have to forgive me, Faye, because I don't actually remember that example. So perhaps I can chalk that one up to burnout. So I'm going to just flip that a little bit and give you some specific. I don't remember it.
It was one of your community that had you know, chosen not to take that leave.
I can't remember the specific story, but what I want to do is give an example of my own company and how they surprised me with some of the things that they did and said that were different from sort of how we might operate on a day-to-day basis, but I think was the reaction to this environment that we're in and how important it was towards setting the tone and towards both transparency, but also leading by example. And everybody talks about that all the time, but lots of people just don't do it. And so the first thing that was surprising was, as a company, we started having all hands every couple of weeks. And it's not something we would typically do. We're a very in-office culture, by the way. We see each other in the office all the time. And so it's very different to not be together. That's been a huge adjustment for us. So held an all hands meeting, and some of the senior partners got on the phone and they started asking the questions. I mean, simply as a manager, are you asking your people, how are you doing? Are you okay? Is there anything that you need? They're very simple questions, and it's not really what we do in our normal life. Is there anything that you need? But so they were very forward in asking us what we needed to be successful and to be comfortable. And then our folks got on the phone and said, how's everybody doing? I'm here to tell you this is a mess. What a disaster. One person led with, I want you to know that my children have stopped learning officially. No homeschooling taking place here. There's a lot of television, not a lot of homeschooling. So they're people that we wouldn't normally talk about these personal things with, because the personal and the professional are all one right now. They led with, these are the challenges that we're having. Somebody else led with, I don't know how you cope, but I cope with the nightly cocktail. And kind of making light of it on the one hand, but on the other hand, they were talking about real life situations. Yeah. Homeschooling was challenging, right? Even for people with resources, right? So homeschooling was a mess. They were throwing up their hands. They were coping in ways that weren't the best coping ways, and showing a side of themselves that said, we're vulnerable, we're struggling with it, and we don't know. And it set the stage for other people to be able to talk about, right? Yeah, these are some of the challenges that I'm having. Janine, you mentioned sort of the Groundhog Day. I don't know if you have that expression, but here in the US, there's both a movie and an example of Groundhog Day, and that means it's the same every single solitary day. And I work here in my bedroom, and I left the screen on purpose so that you could see, this is it. This is 4 months in of, 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day sitting in the bedroom. It gets quite the same, and it's quite challenging. And so some days are better and some days are worse. So the leading by example was specific questions. How are you? What do you need? Is there anything you can do? It was leaders unveiling themselves and showing themselves to be a little bit more human. And the final thing we did is I got an email a couple of weeks ago that said, we're going to close for a week and everybody's to log off. And if you can choose to go away if you like. In California, going away is not that easy right now. So, but we would like you to be disconnected from work for a solid week because we believe that everybody needs it. And that something they had heard where people were feeling kind of overwhelmed by it all. And so even our leaders did a pretty good job of disconnecting, perhaps not 100%, but it was very, very quiet, and we were able to just get away from work for a little while and maybe process. So those are some examples of, it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to think deeply about it, but you have to check in on your people and you have to ask questions, and to Dan's point, create that safe space of how do you allow people to actually speak about things that we might not normally speak about in our work environment.
Yeah. And also, sorry, Paula, to back that up as well, something that we did was we had our region-wide weekly live stream with our CEO. And every single live stream from day one, he mentioned mental well-being. We understand this is going on. We understand this. There was no shying away from it. And you have to use the right language. You have to take the topic, take the bull by the horns, and make people feel safe enough that this is something that we're very aware of and that we want you all to appreciate, understand, and speak to as well. We also had guest speakers on these region-wide calls. And a couple of times we had two different mental well-being practitioners and experts in. And one thing that was really great to see was they got equal airtime than the CFO, than the Chief People Officer, than anyone else on that call. It wasn't 10 minutes at the end, could you just wrap up for us? They got their 20 minutes, they got Q&A, they were treated like any other subject matter expert. So the investment you make into developing that culture is so important.
Yeah, I wanted to really highlight a point of Paula's story, though, that just in case it's not obvious, which is the vulnerability that the leadership demonstrated first. So it's not enough just to be empathetic and pay attention to these things. You have to reveal part of yourself as a leader to show that it's safe to be vulnerable, to reveal yourself. And this is kind of like lowering your armor so that the team can lower their armor. It has to be reciprocal. And that vulnerability has to be built into all your work processes and all your habits, because you could talk about how much you care about well-being all day, but unless you're showing your struggles and how you're facing the world and what you're dealing with, your team won't feel safe sharing what they're dealing with, and then that leads to a lack of trust, and that trust will then undermine the psychological safety, to Sunaina's point, and that will lead to burnout in itself, because you won't feel connected with the organization or safe to be yourself.
And how do you achieve that? You know, it takes a lot of bravery from a leader to be able to do that and create the environment where you're also asking for a similar response from your staff. Do you have any, you know, mechanisms that you can suggest that allow people to make a start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes broader than COVID. This just goes to general leadership and authentic leadership. And in order to be able to lead other people, you need to learn how to lead yourself, and you have to really do a lot of internal work. And this is why, like, Janine's an executive coach, and everyone here is talking about mindfulness and being aware of themselves. So understanding your own psychology, your own biases, your own fears, and not being controlled by them. And that's really difficult, but you have to do the work, and it takes time.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that comment Dan made around the self, the work with the self, and the fact that leaders are so accustomed in normal times to relying on their intellect, their ability to, you know, motivate and get others to do the work. And what's happening now is there needs to be more tools in the tool belt of leadership. And that means not only achievement, but meeting others where they are and being really interested and curious. Sunayana mentioned curiosity a lot, around others' well-being and things that are not just work-oriented. So having a cadence of meeting with employees frequently, but really doing that appropriate questioning around the personal first, getting to the personal, checking in, really caring, being present with that conversation before moving on to accomplishments and what has been, you know, contributed from a work perspective. And the leadership, I've seen so much desire for improving in that way and really making, being prepared in this current environment, in this crisis. And the talk about mental, you know, wellness, emotional and mental wellness has elevated so much and been so accepted in our culture now that Dan's company and other companies that aim to do the same thing are being widely adopted by startups as a benefit to add. It's really interesting that everyone's thinking about it and valuing what it does for employees.
Now, I think, you know, it's really interesting what you're saying, that, you know, it takes a lot of boldness for a leader to actually ask how you are and want the response and actually anticipate the response. And it's hopeful that your staff will say something other than "I'm fine." I was interested, Dan, in a recent blog post that you'd written about a new piece of functionality in Range that allowed your staff members to actually talk about how they are feeling, but in emoji form.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually been a core feature since one of the early prototypes, and it's essentially a form of micro vulnerability. So when people are disconnected from the workplace, sorry, I'm gonna rewind a little bit. When you're in the workplace, you have all these micro interactions. So you go into the kitchen or you meet in the elevator, and there's these moments of micro vulnerability where you have all this body language. You maybe ask about the weekend, and basically it's this exchange of, I'm safe, we're on the same team, we're on the same side, we're not enemies. And it goes back to very base human responses from you know, millennia ago. So when you're not in the same office, those belonging cues, as they're called, degrade. So what we realized was that we needed to encourage people to create these moments of micro vulnerability. So yeah, every day you check in and you just choose a silly emoji for your mood. That could be anything from like a Z's emoji to like a spinny eye emoji. And it just adds a bit of levity, which you can talk about how you're showing up to work. And then you can actually have a conversation about the emoji instead of like, hey, Dan, you look really tired. What's going on? It's like, so what's the deal with the emoji? And so it just adds a little bit of fun and introspection and then sharing and revealing yourself. So it's all about incremental vulnerability. We also ask team building questions every day, so an icebreaker. So again, that could be anything about from what did you do at the weekend to what's your favorite animal, was one we had this week, which was really silly, to something about how do you deal with feedback, or like what are your biggest career goals. And again, this gives you talking points both as peers but also in the reporting relationship to start connecting on a truly human level.
I always love to see, because I'm such an innovation and tech geek at heart, I love to see when technologies are actually helping you to have more human conversations. I think it's such a thread for our future of work. that it really resonates with me, that ability to help people connect through technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think like technology can't solve these problems because they're human problems, but I think Churchill had the quote which is like, we build the buildings and the buildings build us. So the architecture with which we live in shapes our behavior, and so much of our work is now facilitated through software. The software actually has the opportunity to be more humane and more ethical and more and bring people together in different ways. So it shapes how we communicate.
I love that. I think that's actually a nice way to segue into perhaps one of the examples that we wanted to show from Sunena and PwC, which is actually about how you shape culture in different ways. It might not be through technology, but in this case, it's from more of a programmatic perspective. And Sunena is going to share with us something that was introduced at PwC during the pandemic, which was their remote working charter. I'm hoping everyone can see that on screen now. Sunena, will you talk us through why this was issued and how it created the right expectations for the whole team at PwC?
Yeah, so as you said, it was sort of launched probably about 6 to 8 weeks into the COVID crisis and into people working from home. What happened is we have a people council. The people council are about 60 people, a very diverse representation of the Middle East firm, and they come together and enable a lot of the people initiatives that happen at PwC. So one of the ideas that they came up with was to have this charter to be able to build a framework around what a positive culture looks like from a remote working experience. So this is based on our 5 firm-wide values, which are act with integrity, care, make a difference, and work together and reimagine the possible. And what we did was we split there are 12 values here in total, and the first 6 represent your personal values. So again, the home life dynamics, and this is actually taken verbatim from one of our people council members, which is kids, pets, noise, distractions, we all have it, no need to apologize for it. So it's a very human approach to having a positive environment to work in. Flexibility, so we spoke about that earlier. The human connection, so empathy and care, again, very, very high on our agenda, and how we all want to lead through these times. Even dressing for your day. So, we often have a laugh about, I'm still in my pajamas, but, it's dress for your day. If you're seeing a client, obviously you'll be in business attire, just like you would be in the office. If you're in your team meetings, what feels right, what feels comfortable? For some people, still wearing professional attire makes them feel comfortable. It's maybe a small but important way of attaching from personal and professional lives if you have, a small workspace or a living space. So that's the top 6. The 7 to 12, the second half of the values are about business etiquette. So have meetings with purpose, not meetings for the sake of meetings, because I'm sure we're all fatigued with these video meetings, and it's draining. 8 hours a day, it's so draining, and you don't get that break from the desk. Team alignment, togetherness, so really important values. And it was really interesting that the firm didn't introduce this at the start. We waited. We wanted to see behaviors and patterns. We wanted to speak to the diverse challenges and struggles that people were experiencing. And we think that these 12 values really speak well to our people very broadly. Even the visuals here are very intentional. So you have the working parent, you have the singles on the other side, and the different environments that everyone can be living in. We have a strong, very young junior population in Dubai. They're largely expats and they're all away from home. So this is a really, really difficult time for them. Some of them, it could be their first, job in their professional lives. So what a dynamic and dramatic thing to happen to you so early on in your professional career. So we've tried to speak to everyone, both visually and through the words of the charter. It's been very popular. Again, managers also, we need their buy-in, we need their support, leading by example on these values. But it's been really well received and really helping us with the remote working environment.
I'm interested to understand how it's landed. You know, has it set an environment to make people comfortable? I mean, I'm going to ask some questions about, you know, how you give permission to let your staff create boundaries, for example.
Yeah.
Has this allowed people to feel like they're permissioned, if you like?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And I think what's also important is it wasn't just launched and left. It was launched and it's referred to at, again, our region-wide CEO webcast, our live stream that goes out every fortnight. Our CEO is constantly speaking to this and how his remote working life is impacted, some of the new behaviors that he's managing with his teams. And our Chief People Officer obviously speaks to this quite a lot as well. We also are very open and transparent that if this isn't working for you, that means it's not aligning to our firm values. So we need to understand more. We need to all be in this together. So it's opening up a lot more conversations and a lot of transparency.
And that brings us nicely back to, you know, your points at the beginning, Dan and Paula, about that connecting to purpose and being able to connect to, you know, the values of the company that you work in, which obviously helps our mental health and helps us feel like we're in the right place.
Yeah, if I can comment a bit on why this is important. So any group of people has norms, and you kind of have to, in many situations, you have to discover those norms, and that the process of discovery is actually kind of stressful and leads to lack of psychological safety because you don't understand what is this group expecting of me. So by being very explicit about your principles of work or your norms, you set expectations up front, so then people know what's expected of them. So by having home life, kids are okay on the call. No one needs to now worry about the kid popping in behind and feeling like they're going to get a bad performance review for it. So any opportunity to really clarify your work principles, your values, your norms is really powerful. So at Range, what we've done is we have a bunch of principles for the team, but then we've also created personal documents about how we like to work and how we're showing up. So that's exchanging like our work situations with each other, so we all understand how we're showing up to work and how everyone else can express empathy. And that's just been a really powerful process during this transition.
I liked I like reading that about this is how you encourage your employees to almost traffic light code the time that they're working in their calendars, so you can see green is you know, I'm away. Tell us a little bit about it. How it works.
So I think especially as we said earlier, this isn't typical remote work. This is work from home with kids during a global pandemic and an economic collapse. It's unprecedented times, and what we wanted to encourage our team was to reduce the stress of the pull between work and non-work life. So instead of it being two states of working and non-working, we actually asked them to color code it, so red, yellow, green. So green means you can do deep work, you're available for calls, you're like present. Yellow is, you know, I might be at the table with my daughter coloring, or I might be watching her on a virtual class and need to jump over, so a little bit distracted. And red is like I'm offline except for emergencies, and it just smooths out the balance between the work and non-work, and then also not requiring people to fit into a typical 9-to-5 workday or even like a 5-day week. If it's better for you to work, you know, multiple disjointed windows of work over 7 days, then do that. Or if you want to front load and do everything in 3 days, do that. You need to figure out what works for you, your family, and both your energy and logistical levels.
I'm interested in how in how that works. But actually, a lot of our teams have chosen to, they're calling it chunking, but it's actually finding the windows of time that works best for them to work, whether they're helping children homeschool or whether they're actually, you know, out exercising. So that's all great and well and good if I know that it works for some of my team members to be working from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. or to a 10 a.m. and then having a break. But Paula, you mentioned at the very beginning, you know, we're getting emails at 10 at night because people are working such long hours. So how do you achieve a balance between teams? If I want to work late, that works for me, but how do you prevent it from encroaching or feeling, you know, adding to pressure of others who have stopped at 5?
One of the things I keep thinking about while we're having this conversation of managing your time, right? Dan, I love that you kind of put a company structure around, here's a lexicon that we can use to describe how we individually and collectively manage our time. So that's one way of gaining control, and thinking about how can I be productive, how can I be effective, and then how can I both set barriers but also work through that integration. But if you take a step back, this also leads us into a discussion of performance and how are we measuring performance, and what are the expectations that we hold of our employees and of our company today versus 120 days ago before we went into this, and what's it going to look like in some future state when we're back into something that might be normal again. And so you know, the larger question, I guess, is what are the expectations that we have of employees? How did we as individuals measure our performance? How did we come away from each day feeling like, hey, I was effective today, I was productive? And how do we translate that into this new remote, or depending on where we are right now on the spectrum of closed to open, semi-remote, or somewhat in the office, or however you describe it. So I think this, again, goes back to managers, but also individuals, both all of us doing that deep work around how do I feel like I'm contributing? How does the company acknowledge that I'm contributing? And then what is the end result of that, whether it's reward or recognition or retaining your job? I know my personal situation, and I think we shared this. Even the environment and what we read on a daily basis can have a huge impact on how we think about the work that we're doing. And so one of the things that I personally responded to were the early and loud and very public calls from Shopify and from Facebook and from Twitter around, hey, from this point, we went remote and it took us 48 hours. And so from this point forward, we're going to be a remote first culture and we're not going back to the office until 2025. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean? There was a lot, at least here in the Bay Area, there was so much discussion and talk about remote is the new normal. We're never going back to the office. We're cutting our office space in half. Look at this massive transformation that just took place. Yeah. And I would sit and read that and feel both very sad and also really conflicted, because I personally hate working from home. So let's just put it out there on the record. I really dislike this way of working. It doesn't work for me. I like to be out and about. I like to run around, and I like to be in the office with people. Number one. Number two, but it's also a way that I personally feel productive, right? I feel like I am doing the work that my company expects me to do. So translating that all into a remote first virtual Zoom call has been challenging. So again, taking a step back, thinking, okay, how are we measuring performance, right? How do we measure performance? There are boundaries, but then what is performance, and what are the mechanisms that we had? Do they still work? And do we need to change both the way that we communicate them and the way we talk about them? I know, looking across our portfolio, many of our companies had to change even their specific goals, how much revenue we're going to generate, how many new customers we're going to have. All of these things had to change in the pandemic world. And so looking at your employees and thinking about what are their day-to-day goals, week-to-week, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter, how do we measure performance? So not really answering the question, but kind of raising more questions to think about around, you know, not only how do we manage our time, but how do we recognize the work that we're doing?
Well, have any of the rest of you shifted to sort of outcome management, if you weren't already doing it, as a methodology for productivity measurement?
I think that, yeah, I think outcome management, I mean, obviously portfolio companies have experienced the pandemic in a variety of ways, both headwinds and tailwinds. So I wouldn't say that it's disadvantaging everyone, but for sure on an individual basis, really looking at measuring outcomes is more critical than the way someone might feel productive, even though everything you said, Paula, really resonates with me. But you have to, we're developing a new pattern of how to be successful and measure those outcomes. And I think everyone's in a similar boat.
Yeah, I think Interestingly, a lot of the companies we've talked to find that they've actually had productivity improvements, and it's not because people are working too hard. When I was at Google, Sergey always had this really cool quote, which was like, constraint breeds clarity. And by forcing people into this really difficult situation, we've had to re-examine all our work practices, and a lot of the traditional work practices were just very inefficient and ad hoc. So people are, they're getting rid of inefficient meetings. They're being able to structure their work around when they actually have the right energy levels. And so I think, broadly speaking, if you looked at the 8-hour workday, many people probably weren't productive for 8 hours. They may, if you're lucky, get 4 to 5 hours of productive work during that period, especially for deep creative work. So by creating more flexibility and allowing people to work at different hours, you actually can get more for less in some situations.
And just to say, with respect to companies dealing with constraints across the board, there's a need for more role clarity and responsibilities, especially after a reduction in force or layoffs. So in fact, that does lend itself to better goal setting and then recognition when work is done properly. So I really have seen that as well as being a positive impact.
Yeah, and actually we've had a couple of questions come in, so I might just take, we've probably got another 5 minutes to run, and this has been such a fascinating discussion. I hadn't wanted to really stop it, but actually just talking about reduction of workforce. Orlando's actually asked a question here from the candidate perspective, if you like, and he's asked, what do you suggest or recommend for those people that have actually, resigned from a company, probably as a result of burnout or lack of alignment of culture, and they've chosen their own personal health or sameness over work? How do they restart their career without feeling that they quit in the middle of chaos? Is his question. How do you maybe start your journey to find alignment with a company?
Yeah, I think definitely looking for value alignment, and there's a company called kevalues.io. This is focused on engineers, engineering teams, but they basically have these profiles of companies where they explain their work culture. And we've actually had a bunch of inbound candidates through that, where people are self-selecting into, this is the kind of company I want to work for. And more, especially with this millennial generation coming into the workforce en masse, they're going to be looking for that alignment between the company they're working for and their own personal values. So I would just, it is a privilege to say this, but I would try and look for companies which fit your personal values as well.
We're seeing a lot in recruitment, actually, that obviously from a company perspective, leaders are realizing how important it is to communicate their values to their potential workforce, because they are wanting to choose like that. You only have to do a quick look on glassdoor.com to find that people, are reviewing company culture. But we're seeing a new breed of job boards, if you like, popping up as well. There's one called the Muse in the States that's very popular, and we have a similar version over here in the UK. So they're just starting to grow, where you can promote your company culture ahead of just a role that you're hiring at the moment. So it's a different way of communicating your value to your potential workforce. There's another question here from Paolo. What actions can an individual take once they realize that they're showing some of the symptoms of burnout? Now, you all talked about that this is a systemic problem that is related to the organization in which you work. Would you say that the first thing to do is actually discuss it out loud with your management? How do you start?
One thing that I would start with is a self-assessment of a few different areas, and one would be a feeling of purpose. Do I have a feeling of purpose? Am I able to find a way to make a contribution? And do I feel like I belong at this company? And these three categories, essentially, if you do a self-assessment, can be a clue as to why you're feeling burnout and why you're not feeling fulfilled. And I think that would, as a self-assessment, start the conversation a bit more, not with the judgment that I'm burnt out, but the beginning of the conversation around, I'd like to find a way to feel more like I have a purpose here. I'd like to find a way to make a contribution that is different from what I'm doing now, or, feel like I belong. And it's hard to feel like you belong, as Paul is talking about, when you don't see people and you're not with them. So these are sort of a way to do a diagnostic to start the conversation to make it more fruitful and more productive.
Yeah, I just want to say it's really difficult though, because one of the late stages of burnout is apathy and despair and feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. So really, this is why it's incumbent on everyone to try and prevent people from getting into those later stages, because once they're there, it's very hard for them to get out.
And I think tactically, one thing to do, we've talked a lot about what managers can do and how we can change the dialogue and change the conversation. But I think we also this is a panel full of realists, and we also recognize that many companies may not be there. And so you may be in an environment where you think, oh, I'd love to have a conversation with my manager, my boss, and that is the last person that I'm going to engage in this dialogue with for whatever the reasons might be. So thinking about, kind of not knowing the employment situation or the company or what have you, do a little diagnostic or an analysis of who am I surrounded by that would be open to this dialogue. Does my company actually offer any resources, whether there might be a wellness program? To Sunayana's point about what they do at PwC, do we have a wellness program? Are there mental health benefits that come through any insurance that you might have, or any perks that come with it? There are different apps, there are different resources out there lately. So I think really using, maybe as a first step, using the time to say, to Janine's point, is it burnout? What am I feeling? What's the lack? And then where around me are the best resources to work, to reach out to try to engage in a dialogue where I will get something positive and not feel like I'm putting myself at risk to have that conversation. And maybe also, the path might not be straight. Sorry, it might not be a straight path, but really thinking about it from the perspective of you. What's going to get you what you feel like you need right now?
And just one step back from that, and going back to the what our managers and leaders can do. Sometimes there's a total lack of awareness about what burnout is, what the symptoms are. So even if you did go to someone, would they recognize it that you're suffering from burnout, or are you just having a bad day? Versus, it's the level of understanding to be able to give the support, even as a colleague, or refer you to resources that are available. So just communicating, I think, more about what burnout actually is, and to recognize some of the symptoms is also really important.
I thank you all so much for your perspectives on this. I feel like we could continue talking about this for another 3 hours, but we're actually at time or slightly over. I want to give you the opportunity to just give any major point that you would like to give people as a takeaway from this discussion. If there isn't anything you think we've covered everything, that's great, but maybe just one sound bite to give our audience something to think of as they go about their days. Does anyone want to jump in? I put you all on the spot. You hate me.
I would say bring back the human into your leadership style, without a doubt. But that starts with self. So self-care, self-kindness. We are so cruel to ourselves at times. So I think self-kindness is really important, and more of a human approach to our leadership styles.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sunayana.
I would say it's time to be flexible. Everything that has worked up until now, professionally and personally, has gone out the window. So just be flexible, continue learning and adapting. We're humans, that's our skill.
Paula?
Building off of what Janine said, we spent some time with our founders who've been in this business and around for a long time, and they talked about how we will get through this. And I felt like that was very important, to have somebody who's been through tough times look at everybody in the eye on the screen and say, yes, we will get through this, but things will look different when we get through it. We probably won't return to exactly what it used to look like, So, finding time in your day to have some hope, which can be quite challenging, and understanding that applying a little bit of flexibility maybe will make it a little bit easier, knowing that we will get through this.
Thank you. And Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think my big takeaway is in times of stress, you need to lay down your fundamentals and get the tracks in front of you. So it's be explicit about roles, responsibilities, about your norms and principles for how you want to engage with work, and just lay down the intentional cadence of work, and then that'll be something that you can all fall back on when times are difficult.
I want to say thank you to you all for joining us today, and thank you for sharing. I've learned a great deal from interacting with you over just over the last hour. It's been amazing, and we'll share some follow-up emails with everyone who's been kind enough to join us with some of the resources that we've talked about today. But yeah, for now, I'll say thank you very much for everyone, and see you all soon at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.